Good.
Okay, we are on Daf Chaf Vav Amud Beis 26b, and today's Daf is Chaf Zayin. We're going to begin the new parak, the third chapter of Eruvin, and the discussion of this parak is really going to pertain to what we call what requirements are for an Eruv. In an Eruv, what we call an Eruv is sort of like the enclosure, but actually that's the mechitzos that we've been learning about. Those are the boundaries. And what actually defines an Eruv is the joint meal that all participants that living in the Eruv area make an Eruv a joint space. And by doing so, they define their living space in the home that they all deposited their food in. And by doing so, now that becomes a joint communal space and everybody's within one space. And so you can carry within that entire place. In Portland, that Eruv is in the shul. We have a shul, a box of matzos above the siddur and chumash shelves in the back of the shul. And it says, Eruv Chatzeros, notify the rabbi before you eat any of this, or the rabbi or the gabbai. And the concept is, by doing so, we've all participated in a joint meal in a box of matzah, and therefore the shul is everyone's joint space, and the Eruv being the boundaries surrounding that space are also everybody's jointly, and that defines the Eruv. So the question is, what can be done for that meal? There are three types of Eruvs, if you remember, we've spoken about. There's Eruv Chatzeros. Eruv Chatzeros is courtyard partnerships, meaning a meal where all the participants in one courtyard or multiple courtyards join together. Join in a meal, they all put their food into one basket, as it were, and put it into one home. And by doing so, they join. That's Eruv Chatzeros. There's Eruv Techumin, which is where an individual puts their meal outside of a city, let's say 2,000 amma away, and they want to be able to travel 4,000 amma outside of the city. So by putting a joint meal, a 2,000 amma outside of this, not a joint meal, they put their own meal, a 2,000 amma outside of the city, they now define their makom shvisa, their place of setting Shabbos is now at the place of their meal, and therefore they will now have 2,000 amma from the city to their meal, which is where their space is, and then another 2,000 amma from there. So that's Eruv Techumin, which is Techum meaning the boundary of where one can travel to. There's also the alleyway, which we've learned about a lot up at this point, where there are multiple courtyards open to an alleyway. And that's really what we have as an Eruv. Actually, in the Mishnah and in the Gemara, that's called shitufei mevois, partnership of the mavoi, of the alleyways. And that's really what we do, because we don't have courtyards. We really have alleyways, streets that we're joining together in a meal. And we'll see that there are some differences in the requirements of a mavoi joint, alleyway joint meal versus the joint meal for courtyards. So in our Mishnah, and we'll begin in the Mishnah, it's unclear as to which one of these the Mishnah is referring to. And as we'll see in about 2 months, the Gemara is going to have a lengthy discussion about what food partnership has to take place in regards to a chutzner and a courtyard joint meal. Is it sufficient to just have light food? Does it have to be bread? Does it have to be a whole bread, or can it be slices of bread? What participation is valid and what's not? We're not going to get into that right now, but it may be that our Mishnah is also talking about that subject matter. Rashi says so. Tosfos disagrees. But either way, the question in our Mishnah is, what's sufficient as a meal to create the Eruv, whether Eruv Chatzeros, courtyard Eruv joint meal, or Tehum, the food that you put outside of the city to allow you to travel beyond that space, and that will be defining your space on Shabbos. So bechoma arvin u'mishtatfin. You can use anything to make a joint meal for your eruv, which again, as we said, would either be your meal outside of the city, and that defines your space for Shabbos, so you can travel farther than you would without it, or the meal for a joint space in a courtyard. Umishtatfin. And also, this is the term, as we said, the partnership term, which is for the alleyways. So you can use anything as your meal, chutz min hamayim min hamelach, besides for water and salt. And as the Gemara is going to explain, it's either water also or salt. But if you actually make a brine, which can be used as your dip for your bread, that would actually count as a valid participating meal. In any case, similarly, we know that the Torah says that you have to take a tithe of your produce, the first tithe. So you have a bunch of grapes. The grape harvest was great. You take account of how much you had. You have an enormous amount of grapes as your 10%, as your tithe, which is the second tithe, which you have to eat in Yerushalayim. It's Maaser Sheni, and you have to eat that in Yerushalayim. But you're not going to Yerushalayim for another few weeks. So what are you going to do with this? So you trade the value onto a coin, and then you take that coin to Yerushalayim, and you have to purchase food with that in Yerushalayim. Can you purchase salt? No. Can you purchase water? No. Similar to what we have over here in our Mishnah, you cannot make an eruv, your joint meal, with salt and water. Also, you cannot purchase with maaser money, which needs to be purchased food. You may not purchase water or salt. Similarly, hanoder min hamazon. Somebody takes an oath and says, I will not eat food, right? Or particularly satiating food. It does not include salt and water, and so they're allowed to have that. Now, the next part of the Mishnah deals with what happens if the meal that you make outside of the city for yourself is not something that you can eat. So, as we mentioned at the introduction, you put a meal outside of the city. This is going to be the defining space for you for Shabbos. This is going to be your meal. And as such, you're allowed to travel beyond that space, because even though you're only allowed to travel 2,000 amma outside of the city, but by putting a meal outside of the city, you're no longer considered living in the city for Shabbos. You're actually living outside of the city at your meal space. And therefore, you can travel from there and beyond 2,000 amma. Well, what happens if the meal you put there is something you're not allowed to eat? For instance, you've accepted upon yourself a Nazir oath, which means that you're not allowed to have grapes or wine. And the meal you put over there are grapes and wine. So it's a wonderful meal, but you're not allowed to partake in it. Does that count as a valid eruv? Because it is a meal that other people can have, and just you can't. So ma'arvin l'nazir, even a nazir b'yayin, you can have wine. Similarly, uli Yisrael, a non-kohen can also make an eruv b'teruma, with teruma, which is the portion that's given from produce to the kohen, and it's approximately 2% of the harvest goes to a kohen, and it's sanctified, it's teruma, it's elevated, and a non-kohen may not eat it. So again, here's another item that you're not allowed to eat, but you can use, according to this first opinion, you can use as your eruv meal. And the Gemara is going to talk about this at length to explain what this is about. Yeah. Sumcha, however, Sumcha says, b'chulin, no, you must have non-sanctified produce that as your meal, because you have to be able and allowed to eat it. Similarly, the first opinion is going to hold that a kohen can even have his meal put down in a beis hapras. Beis hapras is a field that there was a graveyard or a grave in that field, and it was plowed, and now nobody knows where the grave is. And in fact, there's a concern that some of the bones from that grave have been scattered throughout the field because of the plows. So a Kohen really is not supposed to walk in there. And what he could do is he can blow, meaning fan the space that he's walking to make sure there are no actual body parts or bones, and then he can walk through there because it can make him tummy, can make him the contact with the deceased is prohibited to a Kohen. So if the meal that he has for Shabbos is in this space, that's a problem because he's not able to get there because he's not allowed to walk there. Rabbi Yehuda So Rabbi Yehuda says actually not only in this field that has a lost grave, but even in a proper graveyard, the meal can be there. Again, this is on the basis of that the first opinion mainly because he doesn't have to be able to eat it. But actually, the Rabbi Yehuda says actually he can create a barrier between the graves and himself, such as he's carried in a sedan. So he's inside a vessel. And therefore it's going to be permissible because he actually can be carried and he can go into where the food is. So even though it's not so practical, but it's possible, that's sufficient. Now, in our Mishnah began with a generalization. You can use anything for an Eruv, the Eruv meal, besides for salt and water. Now, the Gemara is going to tell us that Rabbi Yochanan says, even though it would seem that when the Mishnah says everything is in any halacha, everything, you would assume it means everything. But actually, no, there could be exceptions. But not only that, but even in our Mishnah, where actually it says everything is kosher for a meal, besides for salt and water. So you think if it said everything and then it said besides, then that besides would be comprehensive and include everything that actually is excluded. Nevertheless, that's not the case. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, we have a number of Mishnayos, which are going to have a generalization and maybe even an exception, and still there are more exceptions to the rule. Rabbi Yochanan said, from the Mishnah that says a generalization, you cannot deduce anything. And even in a place where, like our Mishnah, where it says chutz, besides for such and such halacha, it also doesn't mean that there aren't more exceptions. How do we know this? Now, the Gemara, it first says, from the fact that he said a general space, and then it says besides for, and even when there's a besides for in our Mishnah, which tells us that he said his rule about another Mishnah. Where did he say it? Since he says that even in a place where there's a chutz, where there's an exception, that means he said it even where the Mishnah does not state an exception. Where is that? He's not talking about our Mishnah. So where is he talking about? He's talking about another Mishnah. And this is a Mishnah that comes up in the Gemara in Kiddushin, where the Gemara goes through a whole list of mitzvahs that a man has and a woman has, and mitzvahs that of a parent and a child, of a father to the son, and so on. So in there it says, a general rule that you may be familiar with. All positive commandments that are time-bound, that have a specific time that they must be done, men are obligated, women are exempt. However, if it's a positive commandment that does not have a time bound, but rather it's constant, or it's at any time, well then, regardless, men or women will be obligated. And now the Gemara says, is that really a total generalization, a total rule? Because there are actually exceptions to both sides. The klalu, the chametz aseish azman garam and Tues, that women are exempt of time-bound mitzvahs. Ba'arei mitzvah simcha, the obligation of joy on Chag, on Yantiv. V'hakel, and the obligation of every seventh year on the Shemitah year to gather together to hear the Kohen read from the Torah. The mitzvah aseish azman garama. These was a matzah also. The first one was matzah. Matzah on the Seder, simcha and hakel. The mitzvah aseish azman garama. They are time-bound mitzvahs. sorry, they are, yes, they are time on mitzvahs, but nashim chayavis. And yet women are obligated in those, as the Torah explicitly says, by hakel, and we learn also by simcha, and we learn matzah from chametz. Now, and also, this that you said that a non-time out mitzvah women are obligated in, is that really always? The obligation of studying Torah as a pursuit, period of Eruvin, and the obligation of being fruitful and multiplying, meaning having children, and the obligation of redeeming a firstborn son. The mitzvahs, these are not time-bound mitzvahs. These are either constant or always appropriate. And yet, nashim b'turas, as the Gemara says over there, Kedushin, these are women are exempt from these obligations. So we see that it is not even though the Mishnah said a generalization, a rule. Nevertheless, there are exceptions. To that, Rabbi Yochanan says, actually, we can't rule from a rule of when the Mishnah says everything is included in something. It doesn't really mean everything. There will be exceptions. And Abai or Rabbi Yirmiyah says we have another brisa like this or Mishnah like this. And this is about the tumah of zav, which is a bodily tumah, sort of like gonorrhea. It's a bodily fluid that comes out and causes tumah to a person. Now, this zav, this man that's tameh, it will have one of two forms of tumah, because not only is it tameh by touch, but it is also tameh by carrying, and also tameh by sitting on. However, as we're going to see, sitting when this person that's tameh sits on something, in order for it to cause tumah, it has to be that it is meant for sitting. It has to be something meant for sitting. The exclusion would be if they take a bucket and they sit on the bucket, that would not become tummy. Even though they're sitting on it, they're putting pressure on it. Nevertheless, it'll be exempt from the tumah because it is not meant for sitting. In fact, if a worker comes and needs a bucket, they're going to say, please get up, I need that bucket. That would be appropriate. Obviously, if it was a proper sitting thing, it would not be the case. So he said another rule. Anything that the zav carries, in other words, it's carried on the zav. So whether it's a person or a package on the back of the zav, tummy, they become tummy. The chosha zav nisa alav, but anything that is carried, that is carrying the zav, meaning he's sitting on something and being carried, tahor, that remains tahor, non-tummy, not susceptible to tummy, not going to become tummy. Chutz min haroy lemishkan masham. Besides for that which is appropriate for them to sit on, such as a chair, a sedan. And the other thing, if the zav is being carried by another human, that human too will become tummy. In any case, the suleka, is that really true that these are the only exceptions? By ikamirkav. But what about a saddle? Yeah, so Gemara says, what are you talking about? Hi, Mirkav. What kind of thing that he's sitting on? If he's actually sitting on in Haina Moshe, that's a proper, that actually is included in the source of Tumah, because it's Moshe, it's meant to be sat on. So rather the question is, well, what about the knob-like front of the saddle, which they hold on to in not to fall off? So what about that? The Tani we learned ukuf Tami Moshe. The ukuf, the saddle itself, is going to be Tami because he sat on it. It's made for sitting. Toughest Tami Mirkav. And the handle, that this knob that it's the front of the saddle that he holds on to, that's going to be Tami on account of that's a Mirkav that's meant to ride upon. That's a proper form of Tumah. So again, we can see, even though there's other things excluded, nevertheless, it's not included in the Mishnah. So you see that even though it says a rule, these are, and and it would seem like it's all inclusive. It's not. Similarly, It says besides for this, there are more things included in that as well. Next. They say also another thing that we have a Mishnah that seems to say this thing that even though something's a rule in the Mishnah, it does not actually mean it entirely, and it could exclude things that are not listed in the Mishnah. Because it says, in our Mishnah it says you can make an eruv with everything besides for water and salt. So the Gemara says, wait, Masu Leka, are there no bitters? What about mushrooms and truffles, which are also not real foods? Well, they may be food, but that doesn't grow from the ground. We'll see later that it has to be something that grows from the ground. These don't grow from the ground; they grow on the ground, and they don't have roots, or rather, they're growing off of the moisture, and so therefore that doesn't count as an eruv. So we see that there are other things excluded as well. Now, just so you know, it's unclear in this Gemara what's it talking about when it says that mushrooms are not included. Mushrooms are not included from the tithe money that you're allowed to buy, from the Meiser money, or is it from an eruv? Because as we'll see later, there are definitely, it could be in the Gemara that you are allowed to make an eruv with mushrooms. So maybe it's talking about, this is the way the Gemara learns, that it's talking about that you're not allowed to make, that it would not be included in the purchase of the tithes. So the Gemara said, you can purchase anything with any food items with the Meiser money, besides for water and salt. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, two teachers, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Chanina, Chad Masniya Eruv, Chad Masniya Meiser. They say the same halacha, but one says it about the tithe, the Meiser, and one says it about an Eruv. What are they teaching? Chad Masniya Eruv, one says it about an Eruv L'shana Elamayim B'fnei Atzma Melech B'fnei Atzma. One said it's about Eruv that when we said in our Mishnah that you cannot make an Eruv with salt or water, that's only if it's individually. However, the Ein Ma'arvin that you can't make an eruv with it and salt alone, but you can if you mix the salt and the water. Ma'arvin, then you can make an eruv. One says the same idea about purchasing with the tithe money in Yerushalayim. That's only going to be true if you have the salt, the water alone, the salt alone, that you're not allowed to purchase it with the Meiser money. If you actually mix the salt and water, when now you created a brine which is good for dipping, so now that's a real food. So then you're allowed to buy it with Meiser money. And the one that says it's true that you can use salt water for purchasing with the tithe money, with the Meiser, for sure would hold that it's okay for an eruv. The one that says that it's true for an eruv, but it could be that you may not use the Meiser money for this purchase. Why? My time of because you need something that's fruit, that's produce, and this is not produce. Even though that it is edible, it's food. Now, in our Mishnah, from this Gemara, it seems to indicate that it is more likely that you're permissible to purchase, to make an eruv than to purchase something with Meiser money. And that is a source for the previous Gemara, the Gra's explanation that the mushrooms are not good for the tithe, but they are okay for Shabbos. In any case, he also Rabbi Yitzchak Masni Amaisa. When Yitzchak came, he taught this about Maisa, that if you actually have a brine, that's going to be okay. Well, what about the teaching of Rabbi Yitzchak that he testified in front of Rabbi Eliezer that in the a household of his father that they would purchase sear, which is basically a fish brine for the a herring sauce or something. Amar Lois, he said to him, he said, yes, even though that it's some sort of brine, but it would have to be that there were also the fish guts in there, which they used to use from the fats to dip their bread in. So that's why it's going to be permissible, because it actually is, it has more food than just salt and water. So you said, so maybe this that you said, that you heard that they purchased this brine, the reason they purchased the brine was because it actually had fatty foods in it, so it's an actual food. That he also said with a fish brine that had fats in it, because that's considered a food, that's considered that's considered some sort of produce. Now, it doesn't have to have fish fat in it. It can have any oils, any fats in it, it will be okay. But salt and water is not going to be okay. Amar Rav Yosef. Now we turn to 27b. Amar Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef said, this main teaching that Rabbi Yitzchak taught, that salt and water that are mixed, you're allowed to put, you're allowed to purchase. That's because it has oil in it. It had oil in it, and so that makes it a food. But typically so then I don't need to say that the salt in the water is okay. Just the oil, you can purchase the oil. Now, even though it's only a little bit of oil, so you're spending more money on the brine than the oil, but nevertheless you can count it on it. And this is the idea of havla, that I'm paying more for the oil in order to include the secondary item, which is the brine. He paid. He paid for the salt water, but he paid for the fats that are in the salt water, and got the salt water included in the price. So Gemara says, and is that even permissible? Ubahavla mishari? Are you even allowed to do that? But indeed, as we learned, and Vatani, as we learned, Ben Bagba Gomer Ben Bagba says, it says in the pasuk, what do you do with this money? You had all this grapes as your tithe, as your meiser, and then you're going to bring it up to Yerushalayim. It's too much to carry, and grapes are going to go bad, and you're not ready to go to Yerushalayim for another week. So what do? You transfer it on your coin. The Torah says you take that coin with you to Yerushalayim, and you will purchase. The Torah says, what will you purchase? You're gonna, whatever you desire, you can purchase. Babakar, cattle, son, sheep, yayin, wine, shechar, new wine, old wine, and anything you desire. You'll eat a deal of Hashem. And you and your family be happy. That's what the verse. Now it starts off. It says, whatever you want, whatever you desire, you can eat. And then it says, enumerates: bakar, cattle, son, sheep, yayin, wine, shechar, old wine, whatever you desire. So it starts off with what you desire, ends with what you desire in the middle, and lists a few things. So the Gemara is going to say that's superfluous, and therefore we're going to say a drash for each of the lists. Babakar, it says for you're going to eat the cattle. You can purchase cattle. Not only that, you can purchase the cattle together with the hides, even though you're not going to eat the hides. But since it comes together with the food, you can absorb that price in the food aspect, in the food part, and then utilize the hides, and you gain out of the tithe. Similarly, with the same as with sheep and its shearings, you can get the shearings too. And wine, that's to tell you that you don't have to buy the wine alone. You can buy the jug that the wine is in as well with this tithe money, because it comes along with the wine. Similarly, that you can buy temed, which is a early, which is a type of fermentation that's done by putting water onto sediment and pits and skins, and allowing that to ferment and meshechmetz. Once that starts fermenting, you're allowed to purchase it with the tithe money because that is considered food. So Rabbi Yochanan said, anybody can explain to me why the verse had to say cattle? Leave it there, Ben Bagbag. According to the Ben Bagbag's explanation, I'll carry his clothing for him to the bathhouse. In other words, I don't understand the meaning of this verse according to Ben Bagbag, and as the Gemara is going to explain why this verse seems to be superfluous. My time. Because all of them are needed, because I wouldn't know one from the other unless because each one's so distinct. Besides for bakar, besides for cattle, that we would know you're allowed to purchase. Why? I don't need that. What are you going to say you need it? Because the Torah just said that you're allowed to purchase cattle. I mean, I would have thought bakar hudam is dabin. You can purchase cattle. You can purchase a cow, and even though you're getting the hides along with it, and you're getting it with the miser money, and even though it's not edible, mishum the kufehu, because it's all a part of one. However, I'll gav zizasa the lav kufehu emaloi. Maybe you cannot include the shearings in that purchase because actually it's not a part of the body, and so you could just shear it off. Because and if the Torah said, "Oh, Son is there to tell you that you're allowed to purchase with the Meiser money, not only the shearings of that you purchase together when getting a lamb, because at least it's attached. But wine, which is not really attached to the jug, so maybe you cannot pay for the jug with your Meiser money. Yeah, maybe you can. So for that it says, oh, the Torah says that you may, and that you may purchase it with the Meiser money. Now, because of Rahman, if the Torah had said by wine, I would have thought because that's a proper way of guarding wine in a jug. But this temed, this water over the sediment that turns into wine, that's just the juice. Maybe that's not considered enough of the food and should not be included. So that's why the Torah says no, even old wine, to tell you that's included. Because the Peru may be, you know what shechar means, which is a type of intoxicating drink. Maybe it means a fermented fig, which is also intoxicating. And that's a fruit. But maybe you cannot use the wine with the jug, because after all, the jug is not a part of the food and should not be counted in your money that you're purchasing with the tithe. Because if the Torah said wine, maybe that's because it's together with the jug, because the proper way of guarding it. Or maybe you cannot purchase a lamb together with the shearings because the shearings are not necessary. It's not protecting it. That's what the Torah said, son, to tell you, sheep, to tell you, even though that you have the shearings, you can purchase the entire sheep with the shearings, with the tithe money, even though that it's not a food, and you're supposed to only purchase it for food. Purchase food, since it comes together, you're allowed to. But what I need to tell you, cattle. After all, we would know it from the fact that it mentions son, that it mentions sheep. And if you tell me, well, I needed to say cattle as well, because otherwise, when the Torah said sheep, I may have thought it's only telling you that you can get the hides, but not that you're allowed to get the shearings. But you're not allowed to get the shearings because that's what the Torah at the first say, that you're allowed to get the hides, and we see from the verse saying babakar cattle. So then the extra is going to be the sheep to tell you even the shearings. To which the Gemara says, wait, let's see Gusasa. The Gemara says, actually, I don't think that's a fair argument to say that if the Torah had not said cattle, then I would think that goats and sheep are only for their hides and not for the shearings. That can't be. The im came because if that's the case, lichter chumana. So then only write cattle. The memele yatal etzon, and then I would know sheep are included. The kid is a kasar chumana etzon. Since the Torah separately wrote tzon, cattle, sheep and goats. I feel like it's also that you can even purchase not only the goats, sheep, the meat itself, but also the shearings that were on it. So what I need this extra teaching of bakar of the cattle. Because if I can purchase the sheep and get the shearings with it, then for sure I'd be allowed to. Then for sure I'd be allowed to get with the tithe money. I'd be allowed to purchase the a cattle with its hides, which is more attached. And that's what Rabbi Yochanan says. Man, the matagim babakar. Anybody that can explain to me the word babakar with the opinion based on the opinion of Ben Bagbag, I would carry the clothing, his clothing after him to the bathhouse. Okay, so that's the end of this Daf of Zion on the base. And Bez Hashem, tomorrow morning we will continue with the basis for the understanding of the generalization. You can purchase with tithe money whatever you want, and then it gives a list of stuff. That's the specification. And going back to the generalization, saying whatever you want, you can get. So we'll see that all tomorrow. Bez Hashem. Shavuot.